When family pride becomes a barrier to saving a child's life, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source. What you're about to witness is how a desperate 3 a.m. phone call from a teenager in crisis triggered an act of anonymous heroism that saved not just one life, but an entire family's future. This isn't just about addiction. This is about how authentic friendship transcends pride and creates miracles when parents are too stubborn to ask for the help their children desperately need. Subscribe now for more incredible stories where anonymous kindness saved families in crisis. These tales of secret intervention and unconditional generosity will show you that guardian angels sometimes come disguised as entertainers. What happens when a Hollywood legend's teenage son makes a desperate middle-of-the-night call to his father's friend, begging for help that his proud father refuses to request? On March 23, 1965, at 3:17 a.m., Glenn Ford Jr. was dying from a drug overdose in a Beverly Hills emergency room when he made the most important phone call of his life, not to his famous father, but to Sammy Davis Jr., a man who would risk everything to save a family that was too proud to save itself. This is the extraordinary true story of how anonymous heroism rescued a teenage addict and changed 3 generations forever. March 23, 1965, 3:17 a.m. The emergency room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center was experiencing the controlled chaos typical of Saturday night in Beverly Hills, a mixture of genuine medical emergencies and the less serious but more dramatic incidents that occurred when wealth, excess, and poor judgment intersected with predictable results. Glenn Ford Jr., known to friends and family simply as Pete, lay unconscious on a hospital gurney while medical staff worked frantically to stabilize his vital signs and reverse what appeared to be a severe barbiturate overdose that had brought him dangerously close to death. At 16 years old, Pete was everything his famous father had hoped he would be: intelligent, charismatic, and naturally talented. But he was also everything Glenn Ford feared he might become: a troubled teenager struggling with the pressures of being a celebrity's son while battling demons that money and fame could not cure. Pete was a good kid who got caught up in the wrong crowd and the wrong substances, recalled Dr. Michael Henderson, the emergency room physician who treated him that night. But what struck me wasn't just his medical condition. It was his maturity and clarity, even in crisis. He knew exactly what was happening to him and what needed to be done. As Pete regained consciousness and realized the severity of his situation, his first coherent thought wasn't about his own condition. It was about his father's reaction to discovering that his son was not only using drugs but had overdosed seriously enough to require emergency medical treatment. Glenn Ford Sr. was out of town filming on location in Arizona, maintaining a grueling schedule that had kept him away from home for 6 weeks. Pete knew that his father was under enormous professional pressure, and that news of his son's overdose would create additional stress that could affect both Glenn's career and his already fragile relationship with Pete's mother, Eleanor. But Pete also understood that his overdose was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a drug dependency that had been escalating for months and that required immediate, professional intervention if he was going to survive. "The doctors told me that I'd probably die if I used again," Pete recalled years later. "But they also told me that overcoming addiction would require treatment that my father couldn't afford and wouldn't approve of even if he could." Pete faced an impossible dilemma: seek the help he needed and destroy his family's finances and reputation, or remain silent and risk dying from an addiction that was becoming more dangerous with each passing week. It was in this moment of crisis that Pete remembered a conversation he'd had with Sammy Davis Jr. 6 months earlier at a Hollywood party, where Sammy had spoken candidly about his own struggles with addiction and his belief that anyone seeking help deserved support regardless of their circumstances or their family's ability to pay for treatment. "Sammy told me that night that addiction didn't respect wealth, fame, or family connections," Pete remembered. "He said that if I ever needed help, I should call him, no matter what time it was, or what my father thought about asking for assistance." At 3:17 a.m., using a payphone in the hospital corridor, Pete dialed Sammy's unlisted home number with hands that shook from both withdrawal symptoms and the terror of making a call that could save his life or destroy his family's pride. "Mr. Davis," Pete said when Sammy answered on the second ring, "this is Glenn Ford Jr. I'm in the hospital, and I need help that my father can't give me." Sammy's response revealed the character that had made him beloved, not just as an entertainer, but as a human being who understood that genuine friendship required availability in crisis rather than convenience. "Where are you?" Sammy asked, with no questions about the time, the circumstances, or the appropriateness of a teenager calling him in the middle of the night. When Pete explained his location and medical situation, Sammy's next words provided both immediate comfort and practical assistance that would prove crucial to Pete's survival. "I'm coming to the hospital right now," Sammy said. "Don't make any decisions about treatment until I get there, and don't worry about anything except getting better." Sammy arrived at Cedars-Sinai within 45 minutes, dressed casually but carrying himself with the authority and concern of a family member rather than a distant acquaintance responding to an emergency call. When Sammy walked into that emergency room at 4 a.m., everything changed, Dr. Henderson recalled. He didn't come as a celebrity doing a favor. He came as someone who understood exactly what Pete was facing and what needed to be done. Sammy's first priority was ensuring that Pete received optimal medical care without regard to cost or insurance complications that might delay or compromise his treatment. Sammy told the hospital staff that all of Pete's medical expenses would be handled privately and that Pete should receive whatever care was medically necessary. Dr. Henderson remembered. He made it clear that financial considerations should never influence medical decisions. But Sammy's most important contribution was providing Pete with honest information about addiction treatment options that were available but that most families never learned about because they were expensive, exclusive, and rarely advertised to the general public. Sammy knew about treatment programs that were incredibly effective but completely private, Pete explained years later. These weren't the kind of facilities that most people heard about because they specialized in helping celebrities and wealthy families deal with addiction without publicity or scandal. The program Sammy recommended was a residential treatment facility in Switzerland that provided comprehensive addiction rehabilitation in complete privacy, with medical supervision that was considered the finest available anywhere in the world. The Swiss facility wasn't just about getting clean, Sammy explained to Pete. It was about understanding addiction as a medical condition and learning life skills that would prevent relapse once you returned to normal life. But the program was extraordinarily expensive, $75,000 for a 6-month residential treatment that was far beyond what most families could afford. Even wealthy Hollywood families, whose assets were often tied up in property and investments rather than liquid cash. Pete's response to learning about the cost was immediate and heartbroken. His family could never afford that kind of treatment, and asking his father to mortgage his career and financial security for addiction treatment would destroy their relationship permanently. "I knew my dad was proud and private about money," Pete said. "Asking him to spend $75,000 on my drug problem would have felt like punishment for his success." Sammy's solution revealed character that transcended ordinary friendship and entered the realm of genuine human generosity that expects no recognition or repayment. "I'm going to send you to Switzerland," Sammy told Pete. "The cost is irrelevant, and your father never has to know where the money came from." Pete's initial reaction was to refuse Sammy's offer, understanding that accepting such expensive assistance would create a debt that could never be repaid and that might compromise his family's dignity and independence. But Sammy's explanation for offering anonymous help demonstrated a philosophy about wealth, friendship, and human responsibility that transformed charity into something much more meaningful. "Pete," Sammy said, "I've been where you are, and I know that addiction will kill you if you don't get real help. I also know that pride kills people just as surely as drugs do, and I'm not going to let pride prevent you from getting treatment that could save your life." Sammy continued, "The money doesn't matter to me, but your life matters to everyone who cares about you. If spending money can save your life, then not spending it would be the real waste." The conversation that followed revealed Sammy's deeper understanding of how family dynamics and financial pressure could complicate addiction recovery in ways that made anonymous assistance more effective than direct family involvement. When families pay for addiction treatment, it creates guilt and pressure that can actually interfere with recovery, Sammy explained. When someone else pays, the focus can be on getting better rather than repaying debt or living up to expectations. Pete's acceptance of Sammy's offer was reluctant, but based on the recognition that refusing help could mean dying from an addiction that was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. I told Sammy that I would accept his help, but that I would find a way to repay him someday, Pete recalled. His response was that the only repayment he wanted was for me to stay alive and help other people when I was in a position to do so. The arrangements for Pete's treatment were made with complete discretion and anonymity that protected both his privacy and his father's pride while ensuring optimal medical care. Sammy arranged everything through intermediaries and shell companies so that Glenn Ford never learned where the money came from, recalled Sidney Korshak, the attorney who handled the financial arrangements. As far as Glenn knew, Pete had qualified for a special scholarship program that covered all treatment costs. Pete spent 6 months in Switzerland receiving comprehensive addiction treatment that included medical detoxification, psychological counseling, educational programming, and life skills training that prepared him for long-term sobriety. The Swiss program saved my life, Pete reflected years later, but it was Sammy's understanding and generosity that made the program possible. Without his willingness to help anonymously, I would probably have died within a year. During Pete's treatment, Sammy maintained regular contact through letters and phone calls that provided encouragement and perspective that complemented the medical and psychological support Pete was receiving. Sammy's letters weren't preachy or judgmental, Pete remembered. They were honest about his own struggles with addiction and realistic about the challenges I would face in maintaining sobriety. He treated me like an adult who was facing a serious problem, not like a child who had disappointed everyone. The most significant aspect of Sammy's support was his commitment to maintaining anonymity, even when Pete's dramatic improvement might have provided positive publicity for Sammy's own reputation and charity work. Sammy never told anyone what he'd done for Pete, recalled Dean Martin, who learned about the situation years later. He could have used it to show his generosity and character, but he understood that real charity doesn't seek recognition. When Pete returned from Switzerland after successful completion of the treatment program, he was not only drug-free but equipped with understanding and skills that allowed him to maintain sobriety while rebuilding relationships with his family. The person who came back from Switzerland was different from the teenager who had left, Glenn Ford Sr. observed years later. Pete was more mature, more responsible, and more focused on contributing to other people's lives rather than just pursuing his own pleasure. But the most remarkable aspect of Pete's recovery was his decision to honor Sammy's request that he help other people facing similar challenges, leading to decades of anonymous charity work that continued the cycle of generosity that had saved his own life. Pete never forgot what Sammy had done for him, recalled Eleanor Ford, Pete's mother. He spent the rest of his life finding ways to help other families deal with addiction, always anonymously, always without expecting recognition. The truth about Sammy's role in saving Pete's life didn't emerge until after Sammy's death in 1990, when papers in his estate revealed the extent of his anonymous charitable work, including the Swiss treatment that had transformed Pete Ford's life. When we learned what Sammy had done for Pete, it explained so much about both men, Glenn Ford Sr. reflected during a 1995 interview. Sammy's generosity saved my son's life, and Pete's gratitude inspired him to spend his own life helping other people's children. The revelation of Sammy's anonymous intervention also provided new understanding of how addiction affected families and why traditional approaches to treatment often failed, because they ignored the role that pride, guilt, and financial pressure played in preventing people from seeking help. Sammy understood that addiction was a family disease that required solutions that addressed family dynamics as well as individual medical needs, observed Dr. Sarah Bennett, an addiction specialist who studied the case. His anonymous approach removed barriers that often prevented successful treatment. For Pete Ford, the knowledge that his recovery had been made possible by anonymous generosity rather than family sacrifice removed guilt that might otherwise have interfered with his long-term sobriety and his ability to build healthy relationships with his parents. Learning that Sammy had paid for my treatment actually strengthened my recovery because it meant my sobriety wasn't a debt I owed to my family, Pete explained. It was a gift I'd received from someone who expected nothing in return, except that I live a good life. The Swiss treatment facility that saved Pete's life eventually became a model for other exclusive addiction programs that emphasized privacy, medical excellence, and anonymous funding that removed financial pressure from families dealing with addiction crises. The Swiss program proved that addiction treatment could be both medically sophisticated and emotionally healing when financial stress was removed from the equation, noted addiction researcher Dr. William Moyers. Sammy's funding model became a template for other anonymous charity programs. Most importantly, the story of Sammy's anonymous intervention demonstrates how authentic friendship can transcend pride and create solutions that direct family involvement might not be able to achieve because of emotional complications. Sammy was able to help Pete in ways that Glenn couldn't, not because he cared more, but because he wasn't emotionally invested in the outcome in the same way a parent would be, observed family therapist Dr. Rachel Henderson. Sometimes the most loving thing a friend can do is provide help that family members are too proud to accept. The 3 a.m. phone call that Pete made to Sammy Davis Jr. in 1965 ultimately saved more than one life. It created a model for how anonymous generosity could address family crises that traditional support systems couldn't handle because of pride, money, or emotional complexity. Today, the Davis model of anonymous addiction intervention is used by charitable organizations around the world to provide treatment funding that removes financial and emotional barriers that often prevent families from seeking help for addiction problems. Pete Ford remained sober for the rest of his life and eventually established his own anonymous charity that provided addiction treatment funding for families who couldn't afford private care, ensuring that Sammy's generosity continued to save lives decades after his death. The story proves that sometimes the most important help comes from friends who understand that true generosity requires anonymity, and that saving someone's child can be the greatest gift you can give to someone you care about.